Hello, I am Kira Scrivener, and I don't know if I've introduced myself before, so I'll do it again. I am reading the Women's Prize. The Women's Prize is a prize built out of the UK that celebrates women's author and celebrates the fact that a lot of women get looked over even for prizes that they're eligible for, so we want to celebrate and look at them. So I began this reading vlog with reading Trespasses by Louise Kennedy, and I really wanted to love it, but I ended up not being the biggest fan. I thought that I would consume it and love it because I have been falling in love with something that I call a fair fiction, and because I really like the ways in which it allows us to analyze women throughout different roles and the way that a mistress slash a wife plays, and the ways in which this compares and contrasts different dynamics. And I just really like intimate, close analyses of how we look at each other and how we look at the world and all of those things. So this is not what Trespasses was. I feel like we felt like there was a gap between us and the reader. And I did find it interesting because Louise Kennedy, the author, she started writing this in her 50s, and she had grown up during this time and was about 7 years old, the age of one of the youngest characters in this book. And that was her experience of the Troubles. And her family owned a bar, and lots of things happened in that bar that were related to the Troubles. And in her 50s, she was diagnosed with cancer and thought, maybe I'm not going to live. I want to write this book just for myself. And she ended up writing it for herself, and then it ended up being published. And I think that's just such an amazing story, because I think so often we view writing as something of the young, or since I was 3 years old, I've wanted to be a writer and I've told stories. And the fact that she was like, yes, I've always liked stories, but writing wasn't a practical skill in my family. She grew up and then became a manager at bars and restaurants her whole life. So she's worked in the service industry, and being able to be like, no, now I'm going to transform and write. And this is the first time in my life, I haven't really worked in a restaurant, and the story takes place in a restaurant as well. So I feel like that really dwells into it as well. And as someone who worked in kitchens for years and years before I got sick, I related to that experience a lot. And I think that some of my best story ideas came when doing service industry stuff and just cooking or sweeping. And one of my very dear friends is doing her master's and going to her PhD in history, and she's like, yeah, if I didn't work this job at this cafe where I pound chicken a lot and make wraps and make coffees, I probably wouldn't be as good of a writer. And I think that skill and the skill of doing things with your hands and talking to people every day is sometimes underestimated in writing fiction. So I think that approach in her life makes me really excited to see what she writes next, because she has recovered from cancer and is in remission. So, God willing, that will not come back and she will live another many years. So I'm really excited to see what she does next. But this being her first novel, I liked it. I didn't find it compelling in the same way. I didn't find myself immersed in the internal world of her. I always felt that there was some distance. And if I lay down every aspect of what happened in the book, I would like that book. But the way that it was executed fell flat for me. So I'm excited for what she writes next, and I hope that it is well received. And I'm going to read other books for the Women's Prize as well, I think beginning with Memphis. And I'm really excited for this because it looks at many women throughout generations in the North family and their experiences. And I'm really excited to see where these characters go and how they go and all of these things. And now we're going to seamlessly transfer into the introductional thing. The first clip that I just had was a clip that I read when I just finished the first novel. And then I also had some thoughts that were going on in the middle of those thoughts that I will insert here, as well as a quick review of the book that I previously read already, which is Glory by LiQWYD Bioleo. And I'm also going to include a couple clips from the Butterfly Conservatory and visiting goats when my nephew was here, because it was really fun. I read Glory previously and I've enjoyed it. I read it for the Booker and I didn't like it, and then it hit me and I was like, oh, I like this. So I became one of those people who I feel like a lot of people either loved it or hated it, and I became a person being like, no, it's good. It's not the best thing in the world, but really you should stop comparing it to Animal Farm, because Animal Farm is a bad comparison to it. I love Animal Farm and I actually do like Glory and have a kind spot in my mind for it, but they're not the same book. And I understand where that stems from and why we continue to go back to be like, oh, but this thing is like this thing, but it's not this thing, so we don't like it. I'm actually doing that a little bit with my first read, which is Trespasses by Louise Kennedy. I was really excited for this because I have a soft spot for what I'm going to dub a fair fiction. And one of the books that I think that I first read that really looked at this was Conversation with Friends. And I was like, this is such a great book. And it is very Irish. So Trespasses is also very Irish. It's set in the 1970s during the Troubles and looks at this girl named Kushla, who I'm probably mispronouncing. I am really interested in this story, and I was really interested in the ways in which her as a 24-year-old teacher who also works part-time in their family bar, and the way that these overlap. You also look at her mother who struggles with alcohol, and you view other people who have been in prison because they were Catholic and then their families who are very poor. It looks at the police force and how British cops treat them and how they like really sexualize and also degrade them, and how all of these things continue and continue and continue and feed into this cycle that feels like it's very hard to break out and make a better future and to make a more positive thing. She's even talking to a high school student at one point and she's like, no, you can go away, you can do university, you can get an education and stuff like that, and like you don't have to stay in a place where you'll always feel bad. And all of these things sound really exciting when I'm talking about them, but they feel very bland in the book. And maybe that's my own take. Maybe I'm not diving into the emotions. Like I think that there is a similar thing that actually Sally Rooney and other Irish authors, I've noticed there often is a detachment, and maybe that's something that I have different sensibilities toward. But like she's engaging with a lot of themes that I really enjoy, but I'm just not enjoying the way that she's engaging with them.
We got scared when it got darker at night, 'cause everyone was missing safety lights. So we tried to use a flashlight as a guide. And now I'm standing in an overcrowded train, picturing the times we had as children while the rain is pouring down the windows and the people push their way. Take me back to my hometown. Take me.
Hello, I wanted to do a little check-in. It is closing in on the end of March. I'm currently working my way through the Women's Prize and I am enjoying it, I think, a fair amount. I have started Memphis as was my plan. I originally had planned to leave this till last and to read some more enjoyable books and then come back to Memphis. And then I heard a bunch of really good reviews of Memphis. And I was like, maybe the early reviews that I heard that it was more like tragic porn were kind of overrated. And I started it and it's pretty tragic. So the original review that I had heard about was from Shelby in the book club, and she reviewed it months ago and talked about how it was like all about suffering and stuff like that. And I don't remember her exact quote. I really like her as a reviewer and the way that she talks about books and things like that. So I probably should have trusted her on this one. I'm really deciding if I want to DNF it or not, because I want to read it. Like, I don't think it's a terrible book, but it's also like already talked about assault and already talked about all of these things in the like opening chapters. And I'm like, I don't know if I have the bandwidth for, you know, sexual assault. On the other hand, really good news has come through because Wandering Souls and Dog in the North both came into my library. These were books that were not at all available when I thought, and I thought neither of them were published in Canada. And then I, you know, religiously check my library apps to be like, are there any more books? So I will be able to read a lot of the Longlist, which makes me think that I might put Memphis aside. I don't want to be triggered because I've already had a very triggering day, to say the least. This is the day that Christina Applegate also brought back some tweets and old footage of one of America's least favorite pundits talking about women in wheelchairs and all of those things. And as someone who has a disability, as someone who has used a wheelchair and uses a cane regularly, you feel so small. Like, I haven't felt so small in a really long time. Like, I know ableism is really bad. I've written about it a lot, and especially using a cane, like, I get stared at a lot. I've realized how many little things are accessible, and I know that I feel like I have to work twice, 3 times harder to even be considered as a person. I know that that stigma goes up even higher for people in wheelchairs. I think I've said a lot of times before that the hardest thing about being disabled is not being disabled, it's the way that people will treat you for being disabled. It's so hard to be so undervalued and also so stigmatized. And I know that that's not something that I'm alone in, but it just hits on days like today. So reading a really hard book, I don't know. I don't know if that's in the cards for today. But that's where the mood is in the Women's Prize. Wandering Souls is only 5 hours, which makes me very excited because I like short books. And it is the one about Vietnam War and about 3 siblings navigating that world. They go to Hong Kong and then they go to Britain, and they're all experiencing all of these things, and they are mothering and fathering each other and being siblings, and the ways that they deal with grief very differently. So That's the one I really want to read. It's the one that like I just got to the library, so I'm like I should probably read the other books, but I don't know, at this point I may as well be a mood reader. So yeah, that's where I am. I love this part of the area because it is very, very beautiful in the summer. It is less beautiful here. I am in the things the sun is. The pretty trees are not particularly pretty now. So instead I'm just out here. I am continuing on my women's prize thing. For Wandering Souls, I've officially DNF'd Memphis and I feel good about it. So I'm thankful that I'm out without a coat. That these will one day be trees again and we'll have beautifulness, but currently we have what we have and we have beautiful nature. This is my plan, to find a place that is slightly further away from the road and in shade, because those things are not fun today. I am probably only like half an hour into this audiobook. They are just leaving for Hong Kong. There's already some hint of older, which I love. I really love the writing. I really love the style. I'm just having a great day. Wandering Souls is making me so happy. Even though it's a really tragic story. That's what I'm talking about. Like, I like traumatic stories when they're done in like really tender and beautiful ways that like talk about the tetherings that are between family. And like, even when she's talking about Anne is now in a refugee camp and her family is dead, she's talking about her brothers going to school and then them coming back and her asking them and then them not ever asking her and her being like, I am the one sure thing they have left in my life, so I have to be constant, I have to be okay even when I'm falling apart. And that illustration, like, that echoes through all of the things. And I looked a little bit into Cecily Pin as well, and this is a story that her mother went through. Her mother was a refugee of Vietnam, ended up spending some time in Thailand, then going to France, and Cecily Pin ended up growing up mostly in France and New York, and then moving to London as an adult and has worked in publishing, and she's like pieced this story together. So this wasn't a story that was told of her, and I think that that's something that's like very true of a lot of people with just pasts in general. We're not very good at telling the stories that we've been through, the trauma that we've been through. This is a story that wasn't told. It was just silently living in their family. And I am really enjoying the story, and I'm really interested to see how the ghosts are going. I think we've also seen another ghost. So in the time when they first arrive, there is this old woman who comes and they see her, and then she goes and gives them ramen, and then they never see her again. And I think that that was a ghost. It's also giving the statistics of this island and these siege of these sailors who like took and murdered and assaulted many of the women, and it's just really hard. And it says that almost every woman between the ages of 10 and 50 were assaulted during this time. And then we have our first fast forward into 2022 when it talks about this family going on vacation and taking pictures and not being able to go to the lighthouse, but just like enjoying and like posting on Instagram about like snorkeling for the first time. And they were like, if they had gone in that lighthouse, they'd see the beams that still say in scratched letter, cut your hair and pretend to be a boy. Shivers throughout my whole body. I think it's so well done. And I really, really love her lyricalism. It's very well done. I now know that she's worked in publishing, and I think that you can tell when people consume books and look at books for so long, they know how to tell stories. And I think this is a book that will hold really close to my soul. I'm quite sick and may have pneumonia, which is fun. But I do have a favorite new novel, which is the best thing that I could ever say. Wandering Souls is incredible. I have loved it from the opening paragraphs, but as it went on, it just gripped me more and more and more. So I had a misunderstanding. First of all, I thought that it was set during the time of the Vietnam War, when it's set after. It is set in the years following. And I also thought that it kind of looked at these three siblings and then looked at where their lives went, especially as they grew into adulthood, which is not really true. We mostly have our main character, Anne, and she is our protagonist for about 97% of the time, I would say. Her brothers are characters and they do go on different ways and we follow them, but we pretty much exclusively follow them from her point of view. There is a few moments in which we see their lives separately, but that is not the primary focus of the novel. Like, their lives are important to the plot, but their lives are not told in their own words. The other sibling that we hear the most from is her younger brother, Dao, who died. And he's the 7-year-old ghost that we hear the experiences of in the Wandering Souls. We also have this unnamed narration about a character who's writing this story. And I love that plot so much. And so much of it is about how we tell stories. And I would say that one of the major themes in this book is not only the telling of the story of refugees in the 1970s and 80s. It is about them and about their story, and about how even near the end it says that people do not imagine that this is part of people's stories. When people say boat people, they don't actually visualize what this is. But it's also about how this impacts now. We have several references to kind of modern day where we see the fact that refugees are still being treated this way, that they're still being killed, that smuggling and stuff like that is still happening, and mistreatment and hatred of refugees as well as Asian people in general, especially during the time of COVID, is very present. And we see moments of this. We also see that these histories have been hidden from the descendants of them. And we also see the fact that these places of massacre and torture are now places of tourism that we did not have, and that we don't talk about them properly. So we see all of these elements in such vivid descriptions with such clarity, but the narrative voice in it is quite different than the like more storytelling and evocative moments in the narrative. During the beginning, it has this really evocative section that talks about how the writer could write it. They could really go into the suffering, the death, the gore, describe it in such gruesome way that people will be shown it. You could also rewrite it and have beauty, have the siblings not die, have the parents come on, have this land of the free, the gloriness. And they say they have to find somewhere between the macabre and the fairy tale to tell the reality. And it is echoed in the closing paragraphs, where we talk about how do we find both the suffering, keep the suffering, but also the joy. And I love meta-narrativeness. I also love that this voice talks about literature, talks about books, talks about movies and songs. They have the account of the Odyssey and how, the story of Achilles and Patroclus and the grave and the burying and how that relates to the wandering souls in Vietnamese culture. And it is such a masterfully done novel. I think that independent of those aspects, it would still be a favorite novel, but that aspect just brings it from like a 5-star to a favorite, I would say. It is so well written, and it's a book that like I just want to buy so that I can look at and like piece together and underline and like write essays about. Like I spent so much long reading this novel because I just had to like go back and listen to it on an audiobook so that I could rewrite line by line what she wrote, because Pin is such a lovely author. And she's also really nice because I posted on my story about it, and like she like responded to me and was like, "Thank you, Kier." And I was like, sometimes I get like likes or things when I share stuff, but I barely ever get them to add my name. And I know that my name is like, not that much extra level. It's on my profile and stuff, but I just appreciated it. Despite the fact that this book has granted the approval of the Women's Prize, it is not a book that is well reviewed or like well known. I hope that it will be. It has just been released, so maybe that could be it, but it only has 600 or so reviews on Goodreads. So I think that everyone should read this book. It is fabulous. I will be very, very surprised if another book hits higher on my love and things. And I think that this should win the Women's Prize because I think it's really relevant as a writer, as a woman, on how she writes as a woman, and then also the story that it's told. And it's very focused on the experiences of a woman, and also an Anne's experience of choosing her brothers and their ability to succeed over hers. And I think that that's a story of a lot of women, and especially women who have to take on the motherly role, which is similar in families in which, familiar loss is made. Even if the child is not the oldest, often that is something that happens. And I think that that's such a powerful part of women's stories that we don't often see. We often see and celebrate stories of women overcoming and of moving to the top, and we don't often celebrate women who sacrifice for other people, that are mothers and sisters who are in that motherly role, who, kneel in the dirt for the people who they love. And I think that that's a really powerful story. And then I think also seeing how we reconstruct stories. And the final line I don't think is a spoiler. And if you don't want to hear it, skip like 20 seconds. But it says, "We tell our stories to live, we tell our stories to heal." And I think that that point is so evident in the way that we see this story. So I'm going to go forward and sleep, but I also just am so thankful that I read this novel. Well, it is a few days later, and I actively disliked that. That was not something that I enjoyed. The Dog of the North is going to the thing that I really wanted to DNF it, and yet I was compelled not by love, but by determination that it must get better and also hopefully stop being gross. It wasn't gross in like a body horror way or things like that. That doesn't really bother me. It's just like when everyone sees the world as disgusting around you, it's just that vibe of writing always like doesn't like me. Like when people describe people and it's always like in a weirdly gross way, or like in a this person is ugly and this person is also ugly and all of these things, that's just not the vibe that I enjoy. I like seeing the beauty in people. When there's that kind of description, I often get turned off immediately, and I just don't like it very much. It reminds me a little bit of Eleanor Oliphant, which is a book that I DNF'd for this exact reason, because I was like, I like mental health, I like all of these things. I don't like people just being gross, and people aren't like gross in it. There's just like no beauty or charm, and it's self-depreciating to the level of awkwardness, I guess. Like, I don't mind self-depreciation. I love novels that explore that. But when it's done with like such ferocity at every single turn, it goes from being like, relatable to being like, okay, this is like, and I'm not saying that people don't feel that way about themselves, but I do think that sometimes deep down inside there's like a level of like one area, even if it's not people skills, even if it's not something that they take joy in one aspect of their life. And this one is just a mess of people being around rats and urine and dead bodies and just dust all of the time. And I'm like, I guess, like, those aspects of the world exist. Do I need them described on every page? Not really, you know? And this is The Dog in the North by Elizabeth Mackenzie. It reminds me a little bit of Elizabeth Strout's writing and has a similar kind of vibe, although Lucy Barton is definitely more of a likable character. There's like that level of like, it's still a little off-putting to me because I don't love the writing style, but it has its moments of glory that allow me to like the books. But this was a book that just had, similar kind of analysis, and they are about the same age. Both authors are 65, so maybe it's that era of like women's literature and how they write about it. There's a level of detachment and then exploring trauma in a very removed way, where like we don't really process the characters going through moments, which always just makes you feel kind of yuck. And I know that we don't explore trauma very well as humans. Often it is hard to process, but like, at least give me some nice writing about how it's hard to process, I guess. And it's kind of discouraging at the end because like we hear things that traumatically happened to her, and there's like no resolution of her either experiencing it and like working through some of this trauma. And we hear quite disturbing things about her childhood and about her life, and they're kind of just milled over and not recognized as an important part, being like, oh, well, I'm sure that person didn't mean to do this to you. There's no recognition that these things are bad implicitly in the novel, which makes it just feel like it's condoning it. I'm sure that's not what it's happening, but that happened again with Lucy Barton in Elizabeth Strout's series, where she's talking about the trauma that she went through and then just like skims over and it's never explored. And this book left on such a cliffhanger that I was like, was it meant to be a book two? I don't think there's supposed to be a book two, but like, just things happen and they're sad and disappointing with no resolution, and then it ends. And we don't even get some answers. Like, you know, from the description, we know that like the cops are going around her grandma and stuff. Do we get any resolution on whether her grandmother actually committed the crimes that she's being accused of? Nope. Do we get like any resolution of like her going through this messy time where she's going through a divorce and depression and trauma and feeling like she's not worth anything? Nope, we don't get any of that. We literally end mid-journey. And I was like, I don't get the point. And maybe the point is that it's supposed to be realistic. It's supposed to be not complete. It's supposed to not have a final ending. But that's me ascribing things to it that like it isn't there. I think Wandering Souls, which is one of my favorite books of this year, and I think going to be my favorite of the Women's Prize Longlist, is a book that also deals without happy endings. There's a lot of grit and there's a lot of conversation on really traumatic things, but it doesn't feel hopeless. Like, there's a level of hurt and there's a level of just non-existent change, like acknowledgement of things being really crappy and that a lot of things don't get better with time, but that relationships can get better with time and stuff. And in some ways, our main character has a little more connection at the end of the novel, but not incredibly. I'm a little bit sad because we are coming to the end of this video because I have finished the last book that I have available for the next 4 weeks, and it's Stoneblind, and I was mesmerized and happy and just biggest smile the whole time. I finished it in one evening, and the writing is as beautiful as the characters are flawed. This is Greek mythology. I really love Greek mythology. This was completely in my element and I loved it for that reason. But I think that even if you don't like Greek mythology, the way in which it tells stories and tells universal stories through mythology, I think is such an important and undervalued thing. I think that fantasy especially can be chopped off as not as important, especially if it's in the retelling vibe, that it can just see basic or commercial in language that I don't particularly like. And I appreciate the fact that it actually tells really beautiful, really lyrical stories that have been part of the way that we perceive the world in ways that we don't even understand. The stories of Medusa, the stories of fearful monsters who are, slain by heroic men are things that we are told all the time. And the quote that I love so much is, "She was asleep. This is important to remember because he will claim it was a battle, but there is no battle to be had between an armed man and a sleeping girl." There keeps on coming this refrain that says, "Do you still think her a monster?" You have these different voices and stuff, so you have people re-examining the ways in which people tell them. It comes another refrain where the storytellers themselves are arguing with each other, saying, "Say that she is asleep. No, repeat it. I already have. We know this. Don't worry." And they say, "But make sure no one forgets that she was asleep." And then it says, "We will, but no one else will remember." Even though this is talking about a murder, I think that the ways in which sexual assault and rape is now talked about often, that she was sleeping and that she was all of these things, don't really matter to the context of how people will ridicule and villainize women and slut shame them. And this was so true in a way that didn't seem heavy-handed. It seemed like it was just universal. And I was finishing this as I was finishing Ducks by Kate Beaton, and both of them deal with sexual harassment and like the way of a woman in the world. And both of them do it in remarkably different ways, but in such piercing ways that I really appreciate it. It's excusing men as lonely or as any of these things for the reasons in which they act in heinous ways. And I really, really love this book. If I haven't actually talked about what it actually is about, but it tells the story of Medusa. It also looks at several other characters in this, and I would say that even though Medusa is technically the main character, I don't think that we spend the majority of the time with her. I think that we spend a lot with her sisters, the Elder Gorgons, as we watch her grow up. We spend a lot of things with Athena called Athene here. We meet Metis, her mother, and Andromeda and Cassiopeia, and Danae, and Perseus, and we meet all of these characters intersecting. We read some pretty heinous point of views from Poseidon and Zeus, and this book does deal with several scenes of sexual assault as well. Even though they don't ever linger on the graphicness of it, they do linger on the coercion and manipulation of those parts and the justifications that they make for that. We also see some things from Hera, which is also really nice. And there's some really nice tongue-in-cheek moments here too at the ways in which, these gods are like that. I think Hera is one of the first voices we see, and she's like, "Yes, if my husband, was not doing all of these things, I wouldn't spend all my time hunting down his illegitimate children and torturing them and then also torturing their mothers, and there's always another mother to torture." And it's just very funny in its monotonous and just the classic tales. As someone who enjoys Greek mythology, this is a complete win. I really, really loved it. So this is the end of the road for me. I really, really enjoyed it. I had a really great time. I can't wait to read Natalie Haynes' other books. She also narrates it, which is so wonderful. And when she's going through emotional scenes, you can almost hear her voice breaking. And I was like, I need to look up this narrator. And then I realized the narrator was her. And I was like, that's so wonderful. So that was so lovely. So if I want to talk about the books and rank them in order that I read them, I would begin with Wandering Souls because that book is so beautiful and so lovely. And I ranked both this and Stoneblind as 5 stars. And I kind of feel weird because I definitely feel much more emotional about Wandering Souls, but I don't think that I want to continue to just degrade another book because it didn't get me with all the emotions. There were several moments, especially the twists at the end of Stoneblind, that made me gasp because they're reinterpreting very interesting things and they're playing with the mythology in really cool ways. And it is really emotional. It's just less of the emotional that makes you cry and more of the ones that's like, oh, that's really cool, and that's done this and that's done this. So they're very different stories. And, you know, if I'm ranking it, Wandering Souls is definitely up here as like a new favorite, and Stoneblind is like, I really, really enjoyed this book. I will have fond memories. It will probably be a favorite of the year, but it probably won't be like an all-time favorite, if that makes sense. And then we have Glory. I talked a little bit about this at the beginning of the vlog. I read it way back in August of 2022 for the Booker Prize, and I'd originally not liked it, and then I did like it, and it ended up being interesting. Something that I'm actually noticing right now is the top 3 books that I have are all books that play with theme and that play with the storytelling itself. So Wandering Souls, Stoneblind, and Glory all play with the ways the narrative voice goes. We have different choruses in Stoneblind. We have the writer being meta and kind of thinking about how they are going to write the story. And you have intersecting things from ghosts and people and an ensemble cast telling variety of the things. And we also have Glory, which is a large ensemble cast. You have the idea of the animals, even though that wasn't my favorite, I do think that it like added a uniqueness to it. And then you also have the repetition that I really, really liked. During the last week when I was reading the other books, I also read When We Were Sisters by Fatima Ashgar, and this is shortlisted for the Carol Shields Award. It is one of my new favorite books. I really, really enjoyed it. And I think that it and Glory did a good job of both using repetition in the way that they tell stories to really have points. So like, because it's talking about things like colonization and stuff like that, it has things that just have like have, take. I can't breathe, I can't breathe, I can't breathe, I can't breathe. And I heard some people complain about this, and I'm in complete, you know, opposition to that, because I think that repetition is how we learn things, and seeing just a page or hearing the same words said over and over again, I think just really drives these things. It's similar to the way that Stoneblind uses the way that she's asleep over and over again to really drive these things home. You see Wandering Souls, you have this character not only just looking at the story, but also looking at the ways we tell the story and talking about how she doesn't want to either over glamorize or over brutalize the story. She wants to tell the truth. She wants to keep both the hope and the tragedy in these, because these have to live in unity. And I'm very interested not only in the stories we tell, but how we tell stories. And I think that those are things that stand out to me very distinctly as a reader, and also why I would want these books to go forward when I wouldn't really want the other books to go forward, because I think that that's always something that I'm, you know, often going to be as a reader. I'm more geared toward ensemble casts. I'm more geared toward reinvention and looking at the ways that we tell stories. And I know for many people that's pretentious or just too try hard or too trite. And I understand that completely. It's where my heart is. So Trespasses is another book that I enjoyed. I didn't think that it was bad, but I was definitely bored through it, and I did not get a lot from it. And then Dog in the North, I actively disliked. And I think that both of these books are examples of books that I would like the idea that they explored if they were explored in a different way, and the style itself did not work for me. And both of them are very straightforward, and both of them don't dive into the things that it talks about. The part in Trespasses that I liked the most was dealing with her in this Catholic store where she's buying these things when she's also on a getaway with her married lover. And she's thinking about, is it righteous to bring back, like, you know, these Catholic parts of her faith to her town that is just restoring its Catholicism when she's off with a married Protestant guy? Is there cohesion there? Can she actually represent herself? Those are the things that I enjoy. And there is some reflection on there. And that's why Trespasses is very much a middling book for me, when Dog in the North was a book that I hated. I kind of feel bad for giving it 1 star, but I just think that it really, really failed me in the end. Like, I kind of want to do a rant review, but I also kind of want to be very kind. Like, I think my review was harsher than it needed to be. But also, I just feel like hot white rage about it. It's one of those books that did not stop at me disliking it. Like, I actively hated it, and I felt grossed out by it. If the themes or the story had been explored in a better way, I could have looked past a lot of that, and I just couldn't. Last on my list is Memphis. I think this is a book that I probably would have enjoyed more than Dog in the North if I had finished it, but I ended up DNFing it. And earlier in my video, I quoted Shelby in the book club, and I actually quoted her wrong. Her complaint was not about the trauma in general, but specifically about a character's reaction to their child being assaulted. And this is the assault that I mentioned in the first pages, and the response of the parent hadn't happened yet, but the response of the parent was like, oh, my child could not have been assaulted because look at my nice clothing. And just the idea that like wealth and all of these things are what protection happens, and that the characters never actually respond in an emotional moment. Like, yes, there can be a level of, you know, hey, I didn't expect, like, I thought that, you know, providing wealth or providing opportunities for my children would protect them. But to say that to a police officer in response and say, no, my baby can't be hurt, is just like really not great. And I could definitely get the vibe that it didn't feel like it was digging into the soul in the way that I wanted to. And I don't know, I've heard really great reviews from other people, so I could be wrong. But yeah, those are the ones that I've read and ranked in not a very quick order. But to go over again, Wandering Souls, Stone Blind, Glory, Trespasses, Dog of the North, and Memphis are off screen because I didn't like them. And then, yeah, I have Bandit Queens coming in 4 weeks, Demon Copperfield coming in 6, and The Marriage Portrait coming in 8. Sometimes loans in the library come much earlier, but I don't think I'll get them in time that this video has already gone on for very long. And then I can't get any of the others because they're not yet published in Canada. A few of them I think are going to be published in April or May. The book that I would have picked up if I had have had a chance and will, even though the long list and the short list and the announcement will all be done by the time it's published in Canada, is I'm a Fan by Neela Patel. This is published in August in Canada. And then the other books that I was interested in and cannot get to are Fire Rush, Black Butterfly, and Children of Paradise. Those would have been the books that would have been high on my thing to pick up. If you're still here, thank you so much for sitting through this very, very long video of me going through all of my thoughts and getting pneumonia and recovering from pneumonia. It was an adventure, guys. And yeah, I want to hear what you think about these books. If you read them, what do you think of the Women's Prize and what's going on this time? I would love to especially hear any of the books that I won't have a chance to read. I would love to hear your thoughts because I want to do a predictions thing, but when you can't actually access half of the long list, it's a little hard. But you know, it's coming up. I think the shortlist is on April 21st. So I'm very, very excited for that. And yeah, happy reading and writing, and I will see you next time.